Hello and welcome to Music City Murder, a podcast meant to give people an insight into the history behind Nashville's most infamous murders. The show is hosted by author T. Blake Brady. You can find his novels at Parnassus Books in Green Hills, as well as on Amazon. Fans of James Lee Burke's Dave Robichaux series will probably dig these books too. One last thing before we begin. If you like what you hear, be sure to rate and review Music City Murder on the Apple Podcasts app. It's the little purple icon on your phone. Reviews help to distinguish the show from millions of other podcasts out there. A 5-star review is appreciated, but it doesn't matter what you say. No one is sure how it helps, but it definitely does. It has something to do with the algorithm, I think. Anyway, let's get on to the show.
Welcome. As the intro says, you are listening to Music City Murder, a podcast about the most violent, unexplainable, and gut-wrenching events in Nashville's 200-year history. Now, we're going to take you back a few hundred years to get away from the current timeline of things, and I'm going to take you all the way back to October of 1809, right at the birth of the country's founding. James Madison has just been inaugurated as the 4th President of the United States. Native American leader Tecumseh is gathering a confederacy of tribes on the western frontier. Boston's in the process of introducing free public education for its pupils. And a famed explorer named Meriwether Lewis is traveling to Washington, D.C. in an attempt to resolve his many debts as governor of the Louisiana Territory. So in today's episode, we delve into the life and untimely demise of one of America's most celebrated figures, Meriwether Lewis. He was a renowned explorer, soldier, and leader of the famous Lewis and Clark expedition that opened up the American West in the early 1800s. But behind his heroic facade lies a cloud of mystery that surrounds his death. Meriwether Lewis etched his name into the annals of American history with a series of unparalleled accomplishments. As the leader of the famed Lewis and Clark expedition, he spearheaded an odyssey that spanned the vast unknown of the American West, traversing treacherous terrain, navigating tumultuous rivers, and defying the elements to map uncharted territories following the Louisiana Purchase. A brilliant strategist, Lewis forged alliances with indigenous peoples, probably in some very problematic ways, but that's not the purpose of the podcast today. Propelling diplomacy amidst uncharted frontiers. His unwavering dedication yielded a legacy of discovery, unmasking the boundless potential of a nation in its infancy, and inspiring generations to dare to explore beyond the horizon. And though he's not without a share of controversy, he helped shape the course of history. But the question remains, was he murdered? Our story takes place on October 11th, 1809, in the small town of Hohenwald, Tennessee. Originally inhabited by Native American tribes, including the Chickasaw and Creek, Hohenwald is the county seat of Lewis County, which was established in 1843 and named after explorer Meriwether Lewis, who was born in the county. The city of Hohenwald was officially established in 1878 and named by the Swiss-German immigrant William H. Coble, who had purchased the land and named it after his German hometown of Hohenwald, meaning high forest in German. Lewis, now the governor of the Louisiana Territory, is traveling to Washington, D.C., seeking to resolve his mounting personal debts. Lewis faced significant financial difficulties at the time of his death. While serving as the governor of the Louisiana Territory, he struggled with personal financial ruin, which contributed to his overall financial distress. One of the primary sources of his debts was the financial burden he assumed as governor. As the territorial governor, he had to cover various administrative expenses and manage the costs associated with governing the region. However, the meager salary he received from his position was insufficient to meet these financial obligations. Additionally, Lewis encountered personal financial challenges, including unpaid bills, loans, and legal disputes. He struggled to keep up with his financial responsibilities and found himself accumulating substantial debts. More to the point, the newly elected president, James Madison, was an ardent enemy of Lewis's political confidant, Thomas Jefferson. And so the new administration balked at reimbursing him for the considerable amount of his own money he had spent on the government's behalf. Lewis's financial situation was exacerbated by factors such as the absence of a proper banking system on the frontier territories and his own impulsive spending habits. He often made impetuous purchases and frequently used personal credit to fund his expenses. Therefore, he decided to travel to Washington, D.C. on his own to deal with the matter, hoping to convince the new administration to absolve him of his personal debts. Unfortunately, the exact nature and extent of those debts at the time of his death remained somewhat unclear. His financial records were not adequately preserved after his death, making it a challenge to provide precise details regarding the specific creditors and amounts he owed. Anyway, he set out for D.C. on September 4th, 1809, on the Mississippi River, heading first to New Orleans and then to catch a boat for Chesapeake Bay. At New Madrid on the 11th, he stopped long enough to write his will and send a letter to William Clark. A St. Louis newspaper reported that Lewis was ill when he reached New Madrid downstream. Some later speculated that he had malaria. Quoting directly from the book Disastrous Deaths, which I am going to lean on a lot for this episode, written by Ridley Wills II, here's more of an account of his travels along the river. On the 15th, Lewis reached Fort Pickering on the Chickasaw Bluff. There, it was reported by his crew that while on the river, he had tried to kill himself twice. The fort's commander, Gilbert Russell, aware of Lewis's national stature, took it upon himself to watch Lewis closely because he seemed deranged. Russell was also worried about Lewis because he was drinking excessively. The next day, he wrote 2 meandering letters, including one to President Madison, and then set out for Nashville via the Natchez Trace a week or so later. Lewis was accompanied by Major James Neely, who, in a letter to Thomas Jefferson on October 18th, said that, quote, "On our arrival at the Chickasaw Nation, I discovered that he, Lewis, appeared at times deranged," end quote. Others argued that the exhaustion from his more than 100-mile journey could have been misdiagnosed as derangement. But it's clear Lewis was going through some things at this time. His struggles with mental health are, in fact, no secret to modern scholars. He experienced intense bouts of depression and mood swings. Critics argue that his mental state may have impacted his decision-making abilities and leadership during the Lewis and Clark westward expedition. All of this was probably exacerbated by prolonged alcohol addiction. Okay, now we've caught up with the backstory. Here's what happened the night of October 11, 1809, according to eyewitnesses. Lewis stops for the night at a roadside inn called Grinder's Stand, which sounds like a modern app that you might download. Owned by the Grinder family. Little did he know that this would be his final stop. The question is, what actually happened? Here is where the story diverges into a couple of accounts, and I'll try to recap them both, or as many of them as necessary, to give you guys as complete a picture as possible. Here's a passage from Disastrous Deaths. Major Russell's account of what happened at Grinder's Stand was secondhand, because he was not there. What he knew came from newspaper accounts from Mrs. Grinder. His understanding was that, upon Lewis's arrival, he asked for a little food and drink, and then went to bed in a cabin given to him, having ordered the servants to take the horses to the stable and take care of them. Sometime during the night, Lewis, according to Russell, shot himself in the head with a horseman's pistol, 14.5 inches long. Yikes! But the ball did not penetrate his skull, only cutting a furrow on the top of his head. He then supposedly shot himself with his pistol in the breast. The ball went through his body, coming out near his backbone. Mrs. Grinder, who was alone with her children and a 12-year-old enslaved girl named Melinda, often called Lindy, was in bed in her own cabin, a short distance away. She heard the shots but was afraid to investigate, nor did she let Lewis in her cabin when he came to ask for water, because Mr. Grinder was not at home, and she was terrified. She thought the man might be deranged. She said Lewis then returned to his cabin. Early the next morning, he was found sitting on his bed, cutting himself with a razor. He again asked for water, which was given him, and then he lay down on his bed, declaring to his servant that he was killing himself to deprive his enemies the pleasure of doing so. My instant reaction to this account is to conclude that it was most definitely a straightforward instance of suicide. 2 years later, a friend of Lewis's, named Alexander Wilson, visited Grinder's stand and later wrote a complete narrative of Lewis's final night on Earth. Here are a few more details. And this quote also comes from Disastrous Deaths. Miss Grinder said that Lewis arrived at the stand ahead of his 2 servants and asked her for some, quote, spirits, but drank very little. He also asked a servant who had arrived for some gunpowder and paced back and forth, occasionally, quote, speaking to himself in a violent manner, end quote. According to Miss Grinder, he ate only a few mouthfuls of supper, smoked his pipe, and commented, "Madam, this is a very pleasant evening." Then he retired to his cabin. Picking up from the book again, it says, Mrs. Grinder said she went to her own cabin a short distance away, where she heard Lewis pacing back and forth in the guest cabin for several hours, talking, quote, like a lawyer, end quote. Wilson's letter went on to say that Mrs. Grinder heard a pistol shot, heard something fall to the floor, heard someone say, "Oh, Lord," followed by a second shot. A little later, she heard Lewis cry out, "Oh, madam, give me some water and heal my wounds." She peered through the cracks between the logs and saw him staggering around between the 2 cabins. According to her, Lewis returned to his cabin, then came to the door, where she heard him scraping an empty bucket for water. Terrified, she gave him none. Finally, early in the morning, she sent her 2 children to wake his servants. They found Meriwether Lewis on his bed. He showed them the wound on his side, and they noticed that a piece of his forehead was missing, exposing his brain. Lewis begged the servants to shoot him with his rifle, saying, "I am no coward, but I am so strong, so hard to die." He died, quote, just as the sun rose above the trees, end quote. Oof. Reading all of this sounds like some kind of horror movie. Something that A24 would put out, a slow burn. Something directed by Robert Eggers, maybe. It's definitely, at least, something I would not want to experience. I can only imagine the terror that poor woman and all of her children and all the servants had to endure for the majority of that night. One aspect of all the narratives that I encountered surrounding Lewis's death was the constant pacing and muttering, both signs of a man clearly under mental and emotional duress. It's not a huge leap for me to imagine that a man clearly in the throes of some break with reality might take his own life, if that is the story played out the way that it was reported. There are those who do not believe Meriwether Lewis killed himself. One theory is that robbers, following him on the Natchez Trace, killed him, since it was apparently a pretty dangerous thoroughfare in the early 19th century. Anyone traveling it alone was considering to be taking his life into his own hands. Others thought that maybe Major James Neely or John Pernier had killed him. Picking up from the book again, Grace Lewis Miller argued that in 1809 Meriwether Lewis was not insolvent and that he had in his wallet at the time of his death $700 in cash in 1956 dollars and a check for $600. Her feeling was that either Neely, whom she described as untrustworthy, or Grinder, the proprietor of the stand, took his money. After all, she wrote, Neely kept Lewis's horse, rifle, dirk, and pistols. She suspected that Neely had something to do with Lewis's murder. In 1848, the Tennessee legislature voted to build a monument at Grinder's stand to memorialize Lewis's death. The committee trusted with the task of erecting the monument dug up his coffin to verify the remains belonging to Lewis. A member of the committee, Dr. Samuel B. Moore, an experienced and respected physician, examined the upper portion of Lewis's skeleton and concluded that it was more likely that Lewis was killed by an assassin than by his own hand. This conclusion was included in the committee's report to the legislature. It was only in the 1840s that anyone publicly stated that Lewis had possibly been murdered. There's also the issue of the guns in this case. Picking back up in the book by Mr. Wills, many murder theorists question the ability of anyone to shoot himself twice with the type of pistols that Lewis carried. They were thought to have been matched 1788 North & Cheney 69 caliber flintlocks, commonly called horseman pistols. The musket balls each weighed 1.3 ounces. It would have been extremely difficult for Lewis to have shot himself in the head and then in the chest with such heavy pistols. So basically, my main takeaway from this is that the multiple self-inflicted wounds might have been more or less impossible given the weight of the guns and musket balls. I'm no expert on guns of any sort, so I'll just have to take the expert's word for it on this. Going a bit further, here is some more information related to the timeline of events from the night of Meriwether Lewis's death. One of the strongest challenges to Priscilla Griner's account of what happened the night of Lewis's death came late in the 20th century. It was from the late Dr. E.G. Chouinard, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, professor of orthopedic surgery at the University of Oregon Medical School. He said, quote, "As a surgeon, I do not believe that Lewis could have sustained the second and fatal shot with the injury to his vital organs and live for 2 hours and do all the moving about related by Miss Grinder." Again, I don't have the related knowledge to be able to comment one way or the other on this. On the one hand, it seems extremely implausible that a man, having sustained such mortal wounds to his body, would be able to wander around in the middle of the night the way Priscilla Griner said. On the other hand, there are bizarre exceptions to every rule. If Meriwether Lewis were truly out of his mind at the time of the incident, it seems to me that he might have been able to dissociate from his own experience and do some of the things described in Miss Griner's narrative. And as if this story wasn't crazy enough, I have to relate the wildest tale to date about Meriwether Lewis's death. The most far-fetched conspiracy theory was advanced in 1994 by David Leon Chandler, a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. According to him, James Wilkinson, who was governor of the Upper Louisiana Territory before Lewis, planned the assassination with the concurrence of Thomas Jefferson. One of the shadiest characters in the history of the United States, the author said of Wilkinson. He had reason to remove Lewis from office, but it seems impossible to believe that Thomas Jefferson would have anything to do with it. As the years have passed, the truth behind Meriwether Lewis's death remains elusive, shrouded in the mists of time. Was it a robbery gone wrong, a tragic suicide, or a calculated assassination? We may never know for certain. Meriwether Lewis, a man who braved the unknown and conquered the wild frontier, met an end that remains one of America's most enduring unsolved mysteries. Finally, I'll give kind of my own thoughts on this. I think it would behoove us all to apply Occam's razor to the death of Meriwether Lewis. And Occam's razor states that the truth is often that which requires the simplest explanation. Of all the evidence that I saw, it is far more likely that our victim here, with rumors of emotional and psychological trouble for most of his adult life, along with a pretty substantial case of alcoholism, would be driven to suicide in a fit of pique over mounting personal debt. According to the National Library of Medicine, debt burden is strongly associated with increased likelihood of suicide attempts. If you're interested, though, in the history of all this, you can still visit the Meriwether Lewis Park and Monument on the Natchez Trace Parkway. It's just off Highway 20 in Hohenwald, Tennessee, or High Forest, Tennessee. And that will just about do it for this episode of Music City Murder. Don't forget to subscribe and rate the podcast. It doesn't cost anything to you, but it definitely helps the show. I'm not advocating for this, but if you were to take your partner's phone and subscribe them to the show on iTunes or their favorite podcast platform, that would also be kind of amazing. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Music City Murder.